right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015. We have reached Chapter 18, and Chapter 18 is the last chapter in Section 3 of the book, and Chapter 13, or 18 I should say, is on how to use model binding in the entity framework. Before going into this, I was thinking to myself, well, there's a lot of stuff in Section 3 of the book. Okay, so in Section 3 of the book, and I'm turning back, I've got something here that you don't have. I've got the book in front of me. In Section 3, which was Chapters 12 through 18, we first went over an introduction to database programming. That was Chapter 12. Then in Chapter 13, we went over how to use SQL data sources. Chapter 14 was how to use the grid view control. Chapter 15 was how to use the details view and form view controls. Chapter 16 was on how to use the list view and data pager controls. And we just finished up with Chapter 17, which was on how to use object data sources with AWD1111. So a natural question comes as to, well, if we learned all this other stuff, why do you even have to use this entity framework? I mean, why? Well, what does it, the advantage that it gives? Well, two things. First, I went out and literally did Google that. So 5 reasons why the entity framework can be your best friend. All right, so let's look at what they say here. Number 1, it allows you to shield yourself from SQL. And as it says there in the second paragraph, any developer either is good or can be good with simple select from statements. But as you write more complex queries, it can get harder and harder if you don't have some SQL training. All right? So it can be easier to write queries using LINQ as opposed to using SQL. All right? There's a reason. Number 2, overall simplification of queries. As it says there, when using the entity framework, you write queries using a LINQ dialect. LINQ is a language baked by .NET compilers that offers a generic SQL-like syntax. So again, very similar to what we just looked at. Number 3, move away from data model. Says, is there any advantage to using objects instead of ADO.NET readers? Frankly, I'm not sure there is any benefit from the entity framework. All right? Now, so, you look at well, geez, then why should I ever learn it? Why should I ever use it? Because it is being used, because it provides more programming power to the programmer, him or herself. All right? Number 4, a neater separation of concerns. And those of you who have been bearing with me all this time and have heard me do lectures in a lot of different languages, you know that as an example, we talked about the separation of concerns between, for example, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, here we have something similar, except what we're talking about here, it says, in general, application logic is the implementation of use cases offered by the user interface. Business logic is the logic of the entities of the business domain. Using an object model is powerful if you have business logic in the model and use the entity framework to persist the model. Otherwise, it's just using entity framework instead of ADO.NET and SQL. So, before we get to the 5th point, the bottom line is, to my knowledge, virtually anything you can do without or with the entity framework, you can do without it. I will say that one thing that the entity framework does provide, and so maybe I just misspoke, and that is I've always been told that what the entity framework does, and by using LINQ, you're able to write their version of SQL, Microsoft's version of SQL, LINQ's version of SQL, whatever you want to call it, and run it on things that aren't necessarily database files. All right. So step 5, code first as the final step. Entity framework development can happen in either of two ways: building an object model from an existing database, building a database from a new created model. And they talk about that in here. So, a common objection to widespread use of the entity framework is that all you need is CRUD. Remember CRUD? We talked about that earlier. Create, read, update, and delete. And when all you need is CRUD, plain SQL, and maybe stored procedures is more than fine. The author says in this point, they tried to explain one key point. Moving away from a database-first mentality mostly means raising the abstraction level. It doesn't mean forgetting core principles. All right? I don't know if that helped or not, but I just thought I would bring it up. The other thing, too, is as you're going through this, if you say, you know, there just was a lot of stuff in here and I didn't get a lot of it or whatever, you didn't do that great a job of talking about it, which, okay, because I don't consider myself very expert on it, but you can go out to here. As you can see, it's www.entityframework.tutorial.net/what-is-entityframework.aspx. And as you can see, it is a tutorial. All right. So when you start looking through here, and I have not run through the tutorial, but it looks good. All right. In fact, they even have a sample project, so maybe we'll take a look at that. Who knows? But I'd say that's a great place to start. All right. So let's get into it. The book says here, as far as our objectives go, our applied objectives: create an entity data model from an existing database you can work with using the entity designer. Number 2, use the entity data model designer to work with the entity data model. Number 3, use link to entities to retrieve data from one or more database tables. Number 4, use the entity framework to add, modify, and delete rows in a database table. Number 5, use model binding to display, update, insert, and delete data in a bound control. Number 6, provide for handling concurrency and data validation expressions in an application that uses model binding. Number 7, use a data access class with model binding. Our knowledge objectives. Number 1, describe these terms as they relate to the entity data model: object context, entity class, scalar property, navigation property, and association. Number 2, describe the difference between lazy loading and eager loading. Number 3, explain how you can provide for concurrency when using the entity framework. Number 4, in general terms, explain how model binding works. Number 5, explain what it means for a data control to be strongly typed and describe the main benefit of a strongly typed control. And number 6, I think that was it, yep. Explain what the code first feature of the entity framework is and describe the purpose of the annotation attributes that it provides. So again, this chapter will teach us how to use the entity framework and model binding to bind data directly to a data control. Now, the entity framework is sometimes just abbreviated EF. It's a component of AWD.net that provides yet another way to work with database data. The goal is to kind of, in the book they talk about there almost being a void between the tabular structure of relational databases and the objects in an application. To help resolve this, it says the entity framework uses an entity data model that maps the objects used by an application to the relational model of the database. So the easiest way to start learning about this is to start using it. And as they show in this slide right here, they are starting to use the entity data model wizard. All right. From here, we must select the data group okay, that we want to use. Now, the chapter does talk about most of these, but to start, all right, the first option that's there creates the data model from an existing database, and it allows you to work with it using the Entity Framework Designer. The second object creates an empty data model and then lets you use the designer to design it from scratch. The third option that's there creates an empty data model and then lets you write the code for the model from scratch. And finally, the last example there creates a data model from an existing database and then lets you work with it using code. This chapter will discuss the EF designer from database and code first from database, and it really doesn't mention much about the other ones. So, assuming that we've chosen the default EF designer from database, that'll bring us to right here. This lets us specify the database connection that we want to use. If there already is one, we can select it from the drop-down list. The connection string that gets generated that you see inside of here includes the information that the entity framework needs and some other stuff too. So as they mentioned on page 641 on the bottom of the page, again, the entity framework provides the interface between the database used by the application and the objects or classes, code, whatever you want to call it, used by the application. Again, to use the entity framework or EF, you start by creating an entity data model using the entity data model wizard. When it came up and it said here, choose model contents, as you see right here, we talked about those 4 different possibilities. The one that we're going to start with is the first one, EF designer from databases. In this step, the second step that tells us to choose our connection, we either choose an existing database connection if we have one, or we create a new one. Now, the recommendation by default when you start going through and doing this stuff is to use the default, which is the one that's selected here. All right. In fact, the author mentions that if you don't use Entity Framework 6.x, which should automatically use the latest and greatest, if you choose Entity Framework 5, they can't guarantee that all of the code examples that are in the chapter here will work. Once we've chosen it, let's suppose we've chosen 6.x. Next, the wizard lets you choose the tables, views, stored procedures, and functions you want to include in the model. All right, if you want to include an object, you can expand the node that contains that object and then check whatever it is you're looking for. You've done this kind of thing before. Really shouldn't be anything that's new. So, the third and fourth step in using the Entity Data Model Wizard were what we just went over. Again, this third step that's right here lets you select the version of the entity framework you want to use. By default, it's 6.x. With this option, the most current release of the Entity Framework 6 will be used. That's the one used throughout the chapter. This next step lets you select the database objects you want to include in the model. You can select any of the tables, views, stored procedures, and functions in the database. In the example that they have right here, we're going to use the categories table and the products table. The dialog box in this particular step does not let you select individual columns from tables and views. Rather, the entire table or view is included. All right. Okay, and there's some check boxes that are over here. The first checkbox that's over there affects the names that are given to the objects. When you check it, the wizard will assign names that reflect whether the entity refers to a singular item or to multiple items. And the recommendation is that you check it. So if it's singular, it will not have an S on the end. If it's plural, it will. That should just make sense. The second checkbox that you see right there affect the foreign key columns in the database tables to be created. Makes it easier to complete some tasks like data binding. Again, you should keep it checked. The third checkbox that you see right there determines whether any stored procedures or functions you select are imported into the entity data model. Now, you might say, well, I wouldn't check that. I'm not going to use any of those. But as you go on, you might. All right. When you check the Finish button, you may see a security warning. And if you do, just click OK. And you should be able to go on. This brings us to the actual entity data model designer. And I'm going to continue that discussion in the next video.